Case 1. David Newton, a 70-year-old former kitchen fitter from Wisbech, Cambridgeshire, was convicted on the 13th of February 2025 for the murder of 86-year-old Una Crown, the offence having occurred on January the 13th, 2013. Mrs Crown's body was discovered on January the 14th by relatives who had arrived to take her to Sunday lunch. They found the victim's body in the hallway of her Magazine Lane home. However, police officers initially treated the death of the former postmistress as unexplained. It wasn't until 2 days later, after a post-mortem examination, that the death was finally deemed suspicious. The post-mortem, you see, showed that Mrs Crown had been stabbed multiple times and that her throat had been slit. She had also suffered blunt force trauma. The attack had taken place the night before, the victim succumbing there and then. Now, how the fuck did the police and Mrs Crown's own relatives miss the stab wounds and the slit throat? Was the body not covered in blood? The body was also partially burned as the perpetrator had tried to set fire to it. Again, why did it take a post-mortem examination for that to be discovered? The knife that was used on Mrs Crown was an estimated 9.5 inches long. It was likely to have been Mrs Crown's very own kitchen knife. The blunt force trauma that Mrs Crown suffered, meanwhile, came from her own walking stick. Now viewer, if I've got you hooked on the story so far, do subscribe, give the video a like, drop a comment when you're ready and donate. Hit the thanks button below, I'll appreciate you. Once the murder inquiry was launched, Newton, who had been working as an odd job man and who used to regularly walk past Mrs Crown's home, was arrested but then released without charge. In 2023, however, thanks to advances in forensic technology, the evidence relating to the case was re-examined, and that led to the identification of Newton's DNA under Mrs Crown's fingernails. Newton's conviction was secured after a 4-week trial at Cambridge Crown Court, where he was found guilty by a majority verdict of 10-2. Judge Mr Justice Garnham said that Newton had a history of entering homes uninvited in search of company and conversation, and that Mrs Crown must have been utterly terrified. In mitigation, defence barrister Henry Grunwald said Newton was a very different man to what he was back in 2013. Newton, you see, used to be known for his drinking, which often led to violent behaviour from him. Mr Grunwald said that Newton wasn't a well man, the perpetrator being a sufferer of depression, diabetes and rheumatoid arthritis, meaning, as the defence barrister observed, that the man could die in prison. Side note, fucking good! End of side note. Describing Newton's attack on Mrs Crown as ferocious and sustained, the judge basically told Mr Grunwald to fuck off with his insulting mitigation. He asserted that Mrs Crown, as I say, must have been utterly terrified, while also noting that Newton had entered Mrs Crown's home, probably using a key that he had nicked basically, and attacked poor Mrs Crown with a knife. Newton also nicked 80 quid from Mrs Crown's purse after killing her. Newton was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 21 years, and yes, let him fucking rot to death there. Case 2. On the 7th of February 2025, 38-year-old Christopher Stockton from Darlington got 25 years for murdering his girlfriend's 22-month-old son, Charlie Roberts. It's pointless to say that the reason why Stockton shook a 22-month-old to death, as he did in January 2024, is unclear, since there simply can't be any acceptable reason. The same goes for all the other acts of cruelty and violence that the man inflicted on the baby in the course of his relationship with the baby's mother, which began in December 2023. The baby's mother, in fact, 41-year-old Paula Roberts, got 4 years herself for failing to get her son medical treatment for the previous injuries inflicted on him by Stockton, who, by the way, she tried teaching her toddler to address as Daddy. We now understand that not only was the mother aware of the physical abuse being perpetrated against her baby by her boyfriend, she did nothing to stop the abuse. This is a woman who, for your information, has 2 adult sons who were born when she was married and living in Pakistan, another child who was taken away and subsequently adopted, and a daughter who is now in foster care. Charlie, who was born 2 months prematurely and who died on the 13th of January 2024, was the woman's 5th child, and let's fucking hope he was the last one. Social services had had concerns about Paula Roberts' parenting since 2004. As for Charlie Roberts' actual father, he was only allowed contact with Charlie when the boy's mother would allow him contact, and that wasn't very often. I've mentioned that the woman knew that her boyfriend was basically beating up her little baby son and didn't stop him. Later on, we'll come to the reason for that. Stockton moved in with Paula exactly a week before murdering Charlie, which he did, to be exact, by causing the baby's head to rotate or be thrown about with such force that his brain moved within the skull, resulting in irreparable damage and bleeding over his brain, in the spinal cord, and within and around his eyes. This combination of injuries is only seen in cases of very severe trauma caused by things like car crashes, head crushing incidents, or high-level falls.
A combination of injuries that are only seen in cases of very severe trauma, and that when you did so, you intended to cause him at least really serious harm.
Stockton perpetrated this fatal act of violence on the baby on the morning of the 12th of January 2024, having been in sole charge of Charlie for no more than 18 fucking minutes, after which he called 999 to say that the boy had gone floppy and was struggling to breathe. Stockton was so calm on the call to the emergency services that a Great Northair ambulance medic thought that the call was a hoax. Stockton claimed that he was too unwell to perform CPR on Charlie, as he himself was struggling with pneumonia at the time. He claimed that Charlie had choked on a biscuit while playing in a toy tunnel in their living room, but medical staff were immediately suspicious. The examination of the toddler that they subsequently performed showing the injuries that I've already described. So, why didn't Paula kick Stockton the fuck out of her life the second she discovered his violence towards her baby son? Prosecutor Nicholas Lumley KC confirmed what we all probably suspected. The selfish bastard didn't want to lose Stockton. Her own happiness was more important to her than her son. Case 3. Was the gunning down of 36-year-old Ricky Berry in Kirkby, Merseyside by Michael Smith, Adam Williams and Connor Walsh on the 17th of July 2024 drug-related, since both the victim and the 3 perpetrators were all involved in drug dealing? Or was it due to something completely unrelated to drugs? At the sentencing of the 3 perpetrators, which took place at Liverpool Crown Court on the 18th of February 2025, the judge himself, Andrew Menery KC, more or less asked these 2 very questions just before concluding that the motive for this particular murder was known only by the 3 murderers themselves. Ricky Berry died after a balaclava-wearing man riding an electric bike fired 4 shots at him just after 18:30. The e-bike was travelling on the pavement in convoy with a black Seat Alteca, which was of course going in the same direction. As the bike rider slowed down almost to a stop, the car also came to a stop. The car and the bike were alongside each other outside Mr. Berry's partner's home, with Mr. Berry in the front garden of the house. Michael Smith fired 4 shots at Mr. Berry, with 3 making contact, and Mr. Berry died from a gunshot wound to his chest. The court heard that Smith, 27, of no fixed abode, was the rider of the bike, with Adam Williams, 26, of Hamlet Crescent, St Helens, the driver of the car, and Connor Walsh, 26, of Simonswood Lane, Kirkby, a passenger in the car. Williams and Walsh were both present to oversee the killing, the court was told. Telephone records showed that the 3 men were in contact with each other in the run-up to the murder. At the sentencing hearing, Judge Menery told the 3 perpetrators, quote, "You all obviously know why you thought he deserved to die, and others may know or suspect why it happened, but I can't guess what the reason was. What I do know, and I'm sure about, is that the 3 of you, maybe with others, spent some time that day planning what was effectively an execution. The man was trapped in the doorway with nowhere to go when he was shot at close range. This was, in every sense, a cold-blooded, premeditated slaying, made all the more outrageous by the fact that it happened in broad daylight on a quiet residential street where families live and children play. You obviously had no regard for Ricky Berry, and you also had little regard for anyone else that you put at risk. The 4 shots were aimed not just at your victim, but also, by definition, in the direction of the house behind. In that house at the time were 2 other adults and 2 young children. At least 3 of the bullets whistled on through the kitchen of that property where Mr. Berry's partner was doing a friend's hair, and so it's only by good fortune that there were no other casualties. Your action showed a reckless arrogance similar to the lawlessness of the Wild West. You simply didn't care and thought that some code of silence would protect you. But you didn't reckon on the diligence and efficiency of the subsequent police investigation." Unquote. Smith, the gunman, and Williams each got 31 years. Walsh, meanwhile, got 30 years. Case number 4. Scarlett was stabbed by accident. "I'd been throwing knives. I'd thrown a spatula or tongs. Scarlett lunged towards the knife. I had swiped the tongs along the kitchen surface." These are the 5 different stories that 50-year-old Simon Vickers from Darlington, North England, gave the police in explanation of how he came to stab his 14-year-old daughter through the heart, that single stab wound causing his daughter's death. As the judge said in court, "What a load of rubbish." Simon Vickers' previous convictions include a conviction for wounding with intent, where he used a knife on the face of some bloke, and he got 2 years for that. He also has convictions for minor dishonesty, the last of which coming in 1999. However, the judge said at his sentencing that given the age or lack of relevance of those convictions, they wouldn't increase the sentence that he proceeded to impose on Vickers, which was a 15-year life sentence. So, what were the events that led up to the point where Simon Vickers stabbed his own daughter through the heart in the kitchen of his home on the 5th of April 2024? Let's investigate. On the night in question, Scarlett, her mother and her father were all at home. Scarlett's mother is called Sarah Hall. She's not married to Simon Vickers, but they'd been together for 27 years. And there is no evidence that there was anything other than loving and nurturing dynamics in the family home. It was a Friday night. After work, Simon had smoked some cannabis and drunk some wine. He was believed by the judge to have drunk a lot more than the 4 glasses of wine that he claimed to have drunk. Scarlett came home and was in her bedroom while her father was watching footy on the TV. The father, Simon, then joined Sarah, Scarlett's mother, as Sarah cooked the evening meal. Scarlett came downstairs at about 10:15 p.m. to join her mum and dad in the small kitchen. She and her mother were throwing grapes at each other, and Simon wanted them to stop. Sarah Hall, the mother, then pinched Simon on the bottom from behind with some cooking tongs. As Simon turned, she caught his finger with the tongs, and Simon screamed out, "Ow!" And Scarlett then said, "Dad, don't be a wimp." Sarah then had her back to both Scarlett and her partner as she had gone back to cooking. Simon was evidently still upset because as Sarah turned back to her cooking, Simon said, "Well, how would you like it?" Exactly what happened after that point, only Simon knows. All of a sudden, Scarlett screamed out, "Ow, ow." And then her mother turned round to see her standing injured. There was no knife in Sarah's body because, of course, Simon had pulled it out by then. The knife breached the chest wall between the 5th and 6th of Scarlett's ribs. It went through the lowest point of the upper lobe of the left lung before passing into the left ventricle of the heart, where it ended. The approximate wound tract length was 11 centimetres. The knife also had to pass through her fluffy nightgown, her top and her bra. That couldn't have happened as the result of trifling, unintended force. The stab through the heart caused blood loss to the left chest cavity, and it is precisely that loss of blood that caused Scarlett's death. To stab Scarlett, Simon must have been very close to her. She was stabbed in the part of her chest which is normally protected by the arm. After being stabbed, Scarlett stood in the area close to the back door before collapsing. As her mother said, the last thing that she must have seen before she died was the panic on the face of her mother and on the face of her father. Her mother called 999. The paramedics arrived at 22:50 and police officers also attended. Police Sergeant Sarah Thompson stated that she could see paramedics performing on Scarlett and that Simon and Sarah were standing in the doorway of the kitchen. Before she understood what had actually happened, she had asked the parents to go and wait in the living room. And at that point, Simon said to her, quote, "We were mucking about," unquote. Police Sergeant Sarah Thompson noted that Simon was heavily intoxicated. His speech was slurred and he stank of alcohol. Now, I don't know who Mr. Briley is. He was possibly a police officer or a paramedic, but he was there and he too also said that he thought that Simon was drunk. I'm about to reference a Mr. Crow. Again, I've got no idea who he is. He could have been a police officer, or he could have been a paramedic, or he could have been some other person, but it would be really strange if he was some other random person who was there. Anyway, having seen and heard all the evidence, including that of Mr. Crow, who actually didn't express a view as to whether Simon was drunk or not, the judge said that he, the judge himself, was satisfied that Simon was drunk and that obviously affected his behaviour. In other words, it played a part in what he did to his daughter. But the judge also said he couldn't be sure of what part exactly Simon's intake of alcohol and also his intake of cannabis played in the offence.
Having seen and heard all the evidence, including that of Mr. Crow, who did not express a view that you were intoxicated, and also that there was no concern in the police station, I am satisfied that you had drunk more than you said you did. However, I cannot be sure of the part that alcohol played in this offence. It's likely it played a significant part, but I can't be sure about that to the criminal standard.
Scarlett was declared dead at 23:50. At the beginning, I outlined the 5 explanations that Simon gave the police as to how he had come to stab his daughter to death. What he told in court was one of the stories relating to kitchen tongs. He said that he was swiping tongs across the kitchen surface and they ended up flying up in the air, and somehow that led to Scarlett getting stabbed in the heart with a knife. Simon reckoned that he hadn't even been aware that there was a knife anywhere nearby, except for possibly at the point when his partner, Scarlett's mother, had been cutting onions. The pathologist, however, affirmed what just about every sane and right-minded person could see. There's only one way that Scarlett could have come to sustain a fatal stab wound through the heart, and that is by someone's deliberate act of stabbing her through the heart.
Simon Vickers, you've given different accounts of what has happened. Specifically, that she was stabbed by accident, that you've been throwing knives, that you'd thrown a spatula or tongs, that Scarlett lunged towards the knife, and that you were swiping tongs along the kitchen surface. Indeed, the unconvincing and wholly implausible version of events you gave to the jury involved you swiping tongs along the kitchen surface before them flying up into the air, and that you'd not even been aware of a knife before or after Scarlett suffered injury. Indeed, you said knife wasn't in any equation except when Sarah Hall had been cutting onions. Given the evidence of the pathologist, this was clearly untrue. She came by that fatal injury through your hand. As the pathologist said, your arm needed to be braced at the time of the stabbing motion.
Sarah Hall, Scarlett's mother, has stood by her man. She has stuck up for him from the word go and insisted that what he did was just an awful accident and nothing more. Scarlett was their only child, and she was a young lady with her whole life ahead of her. The family all got on together, and in a moment of madness, if you like, that was destroyed. Scarlett's life was ended by her own father, someone she would never have expected to have done any such thing to her, someone she trusted and loved. Oh, I assume she did, because there's no evidence that the situation was any different. There's lots of speculation and gossip online, of course, about why Simon Vickers did what he did to his daughter. Some people say that Scarlett was, at the point when Simon stabbed her, just about to reveal a really devastating secret against her father that would have horrified her mother and broken the whole family down. That's just one story that people have come up with to explain what Simon did. I don't believe it for a minute, personally. It's all speculation. Others are saying that it had to have been an accident and therefore it couldn't be deemed murder. It should have been deemed unlawful act manslaughter, where you get a much lighter sentence usually. But as the judge says, Simon had to have picked up the knife. If you pick up a knife and go towards someone with it and stab them through the heart, you have intended either to kill them or to cause them serious harm. Intending to kill or to cause serious harm are the mental element of the act of murder, and of course the physical element is the murder itself. So on those two bases, it had to be deemed an act of murder, not an act of unlawful act manslaughter. Honestly, poor Scarlett, young lady, life ended in a moment of total craziness. Case 5 and Case 6. For the brutal and sadistic murder of 68-year-old Franklin Ingram, which took place on the 22nd of June 2024, 56-year-old Martin Cary is now doing 13 years, while 56-year-old Mark Sothcott is doing 8 years. The two were sentenced on the 14th of February 2025, having been convicted of murder back in December 2024. Cary was Mr Ingram's neighbour. He and Sothcott, the two blokes being friends, head-butted and hammer-whipped their victim in Cary's flat in Raglan Terrace, Yeovil, Somerset. It took more than 18 hours for either of the men to call the emergency services, and when Cary did phone 999, he falsely claimed to have found Frank deceased on his sofa. The jury at Bristol Crown Court unanimously found both men guilty of murder after a 3-week trial. They had been told that on the 22nd of June, Mr Ingram and Cary had spoken after Cary left rubbish near Mr Ingram's flat. A CCTV recording was also played in which Mr Ingram described Cary as an idiot and said he was going to contact the housing association responsible about what had happened. However, the prosecution said that shortly before 11 p.m, an angry Mr Ingram went up to Cary's flat, where both Cary and Sothcott were, and he was armed with a hammer. A row broke out between Mr Ingram and Cary, which then developed into a fight between all three men. The court heard how the victim was head-butted, as I mentioned earlier, and also struck with a camera, sustaining injuries to his face, head, torso, arms and legs. It wasn't until around 18:40 the next day that Cary called the ambulance to say he had found Mr Ingram dead. He claimed his neighbour had visited his flat the night before in an agitated state and that he had let him sleep on his sofa. The call handler asked Cary to put Mr Ingram in the recovery position, but Cary refused to do so. When paramedics arrived, they found several wounds that weren't consistent with Cary's story. Cary was arrested the same day, while Sothcott was arrested the following day after police received information from members of the public about comments that he had made while leaving Raglan Terrace the night that Mr Ingram was killed. Detectives were able to find audio from CCTV cameras, which allowed them to conclude that they both knew that Mr Ingram had died during the night. 13 years and 8 years. What an insult to Mr Ingram. Case 7. On the 14th of February 2025, 20-year-old Jaden Sheriff was sentenced to life with a minimum of 19 years for the murder of 37-year-old Robert Weston in South Harrow. As a result of a dispute, whose details I couldn't trace, on the 26th of February 2024, Sheriff stabbed Mr Weston twice over in South Harrow, Middlesex. Despite the best efforts of the emergency services, Mr Weston was pronounced dead at the scene. In initial interviews with officers, Sheriff claimed that he had accidentally stabbed Mr Weston in self-defence, alleging that Mr Weston had pulled a knife out on him. However, witnesses gave police a very different story, saying, as mentioned, that Sheriff had set upon Mr Weston following a dispute. Forensic evidence revealed that his wounds could only have been caused by a deliberate stabbing motion to the chest. While the murder took place in Harrow, both the perpetrator and the victim lived in Hackney, and no, I've got no idea what they were each doing in Harrow at the time of the offence. Up in Hackney, the two were neighbours. Investigators obtained phone records which showed that Robert had called 999 to complain about Sheriff just 3 days before he was stabbed. He had told police that he'd been threatened in his own house after an argument with Sheriff. That statement was used at trial to illustrate the spiralling relationship between the two men, which, only days later, culminated in Mr Weston's murder. Sheriff was found guilty of murder at the Old Bailey on the 30th of January 2025. If this video has gripped you, I recommend you to watch this one next. I'll meet you there.